Um, Good evening. On behalf of the League of Women Voters of the Palatine Area and the Palatine Cool Cities Environmental Team, I'd like to welcome you to this evening's program, Transportation Transformation, Plugging into a Greener Future. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization which encourages active participation in government. It works to influence public policy through education and advocacy. The League has a long-standing policy position on the environment. Before I introduce Jeff Cressman from the Palatine Cool Cities Environmental Team, I'd like to go over a few program reminders. Please keep yourself muted through the entire program. Please put questions for Representative Casten in the chat. This program is being recorded and will be posted on the League of Women Palatine Area website. Topic resources will be displayed at the conclusion of the program. These will be sent to all participants and will be put on our website. And with that, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Jeff Cressman.
Thank you, Jackie. My wife, Andrea, and I founded Palatine Cool Cities Environmental Team several years ago. Our mission is this. We are a group of concerned citizens dedicated to helping residents and government of Palatine and the surrounding area proactively deal with climate change, energy efficiency, renewable energy use, transportation efficiency, land use, water conservation and management, and other related issues. We welcome citizens of any background, age, and political persuasion. One of our key projects over the past several years has been to get the village government of Palatine to first be aware of, which they weren't, and then to endorse the Greenest Region 2 Compact as set forth by the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus. However, despite endorsing the document, the village has yet to really act on it. So that's our next important task. Now I will introduce tonight's guest speaker. Sean Casten is currently serving in his second term as a U.S. representative serving Illinois' 6th Congressional District. As a congressman, scientist, and clean energy entrepreneur, Sean's mission is to combat the climate crisis and protect our planet for future generations. Sean has championed high-impact, market-based climate change legislation as a member of the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis and the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee. With regard to transportation's role in combating climate crisis, Representative Casten has stated, passing legislation to begin decarbonizing the transportation sector could and should have happened years ago, but the next best time is now. Please welcome, silently of course, Representative Sean Casten.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Thank you all for doing this, and all of you at the League for keeping our voters educated, our citizens educated, regardless of whether you vote, but I hope you vote. I am increasingly really bullish on our ability to make meaningful and quick decarbonization in the transportation sector. And I also think that the single biggest problem we're not talking about yet. So let me tell you why I'm bullish and talk about the big problems, then look forward to your questions. There's been this axiom in the environmental community for a long time that we have to electrify everything and then, or in parallel, convert to zero carbon power sources. And I was skeptical about that for a while because I just couldn't see the way to get the transportation sector, liquid fuels are pretty awesome, they're energy dense. And we have just seen in the last 2 decades such a revolution in battery technology, from lead acid to metal hydride to lithium ion, where you can now buy a car that costs darn near about the same as an internal combustion engine with a 350-mile range and no maintenance. And all of that's really pretty remarkable. The second reason I'm bullish is because we are now seeing the demand for electric vehicles really driven by the consumer. And, years and years ago, back when I was a technology consultant, I used to beat up on some of the auto companies because I said, name any advance in automotive technology that didn't start in luxury cars. From power steering to GPS to FM radios to 8-track cassette players, integrated starter alternators, all those things started in luxury cars and worked down. And the auto industry kept trying to push electric vehicles into, commuter cars that are low margin and that people didn't really want. And we've really seen a revolution in the last 5 years of introducing luxury cars that are high margin cars that the car companies can make money on. And now that they become aspirational because everybody wants to own the fancy luxury car, and you start to create some pull. And I think a lot of what informs GM's recent announcement is them realizing that the consumers are now demanding these things, and they're going to have to figure out a way through that. A lot of what drives the recent news that Exxon has a huge loss is because they're having to write down some of the values of their assets because the markets are now expecting electric vehicle penetration to start to meaningfully reduce demand for gasoline. That's really, really cool. And it's going to continue to, those trends are going to continue to advance. More market pull is going to increase demand, going to come up the learning curve quicker. We're not done with battery technology. There's really, really interesting battery technologies being developed at Argonne right now. Next generation electrodes and electrolytes and packaging these together. Bill Foster and I got a bill through in the last session. Was called the BEST Battery Energy Storage Technology Act, but $1 billion split basically with a half of that for R&D for new batteries and a half of that for deployment of existing batteries, more in a grid application. But all that's going to continue to push forward. So that's really good and cause for optimism. Now let's talk about the hard part. We're not moving nearly fast enough. We've got to get these out much, much quicker than the technology currently allows or than consumer demand allows. And there's a huge problem because electrifying the vehicle fleet is a great thing, but we don't want to do it if we're still going to depend on upstream coal power. So we got to get the grid greener. Well, moving to a zero carbon grid means that we're going to move where the generation is located, because the best places to generate zero carbon energy tend to be more in the Southwest for solar, the Midwest wind corridor. That's not necessarily where the load is. As we electrify everything, we're also talking about changing where the load is, right? So it's not moving from Arizona to the cities. Yes, there's that too, but it's moving from Arizona to interstate highway corridors, wherever we're going to build this charging infrastructure. And for us to manage a transition that quickly, we need to figure out how to build a lot of transmission really quickly. Because if we don't have the wires where the load is, then it doesn't matter because you can't get access. If you can't sell power to where the power is needed, then you're not going to build a generator because you can't access a market to tie into that. And if you want to know what happens when you don't have transmission into the right area and there's a demand that can't be met, look at what's happening in Texas right now. The ERCOT grid is isolated from the rest of the grid. They've had to dispatch gas to heat homes, and now they're turning the power off. We are really, really bad at building transmission capacity in this country. And we're bad largely because our regulatory structure is so balkanized. But to put in context how much we have to do, we use about 100 quadrillion BTUs of energy every year in this country. And it varies a little bit, it's not exactly right, but transportation is roughly a third of that, electricity is roughly a third of that, and industrial and everything else is roughly a third. So electrifying the transportation sector requires an amount of energy equal to the amount of energy we make in our entire electric sector right now at the outer end. Now we're not going to get all the way there because I think long haul trucking is going to be a long way to get there, but you need to think in terms of those scales. Bills we did last term, I mentioned the one with Bill Foster, the BEST Act, which is R&D and deployment. I introduced a bill last term that we'll be reintroducing and I forget what the exact title is, but it's basically bringing back an old idea from Senator Bingaman of fee-bates, with the idea that we will steadily ratchet up fuel economy, not by periodically updating CAFE standards, but by setting a tax credit where the more fuel efficient you are, the bigger tax credit you get. And if you are less efficient than the median vehicle, you pay a tax penalty, and you shape it to be revenue neutral. The dirty cars pay the clean cars, and so you accelerate the market pull by making cleaner cars more efficient. And we've structured so that electric vehicles count in that as well at the good end of that spectrum. So we'll keep pushing for that. Have got decent amount of support last term and help with the market pull. We also introduced a bill last year to make the alternative fuel refueling credit permanent. We did get a short extension in the omnibus bill, but this provides a $30,000 tax credit for businesses that install alternative fuel charging infrastructure, fueling infrastructure, not just electric, biofuels as well, and a $1,000 credit for homeowners. this is one of these things that always expires, and if you never know if it's going to be renewed after it's expired, it's hard to plan for. So the bill introduced last term was try to make that permanent. We'll keep pushing on that. With the Biden administration, we are going to see a huge amount of pull from the executive branch. So they've announced using the purchasing power of the federal government to do things like electrify our whole federal vehicle fleet, all the post office trucks. Huge impact, and those are almost a perfect vehicle to electrify, right? You know, you drive a route, you come back in, you can plug in overnight, and all that stopping and starting is really horrible from an emissions and efficiency perspective, an internal combustion engine. So I think you're going to see a lot of that pull from the vehicle fleet. We will also have at some point in the not too distant future, we'll be talking about a fairly sizable infrastructure bill. And I don't know what the details of that will be yet, but I'm sure that that bill is going to include a significant investment, both public and private money in charging infrastructure and electrification. So again, a lot of market pull and making it easier. But I'm going to come back to the big remaining issue. How are we going to upgrade the transmission quick enough? And this is the thing that I said at the start, that I think the biggest issue we aren't really talking about. And when I say we, I mean all of us. I was on a call with Gina McCarthy this morning, and we were talking about how we can really use a whole of government approach to address climate. She was there from the executive branch. We had a number of my colleagues on from the legislative branch. And we got to this question of transmission and said, who is the whole of government that has to be in transmission? The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that sets a lot of the rules is an independent regulator, as they should be. Commissioners have terms that extend beyond presidents. They're supposed to be largely independent of politics and just sorting out basic issues of market design and line siting. A lot of those rules are set at the state level. And so functionally, it's very hard to get everybody in the room. But Chairman Glick, who I think is going to be one of the most important people in the Biden administration for climate change, is now the chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And he's been making some noise recently that they really need to relook at Order 1000. Order 1000 was a FERC order from probably 10 years ago that aimed to address the fact that the incentive models in existing electric utilities don't provide incentives to build for investor-owned utilities to build transmission when it connects their service territory to another one. Who owns that? Who gets the benefit? How does that go through? Order 1000 was supposed to fix that, and it's turned out that it hasn't really worked. And everybody in the electric industry knows it hasn't worked quite as well. So he wants to open another hearing on it. He gets it. He understands. The conversation I had with we were referring to him as her as Czarina Gina, and finally she said, just call me Gina. But Gina McCarthy was, how do we work to make sure those things we all want to do work while still recognizing that FERC needs to be an independent agency? And just to sail into the hard parts, a big part of the reason why it's so hard to build transmission is that if you want to build a transmission line in this country, you have to get approval from every jurisdiction that you go through. So you get a permit to build in one town, you get to the border of that town, you get a permit from the next town, then you hit a county line, you got to get the next county administrator to weigh in. And there is no single controlling agency that oversees that process. By contrast, if you want to build a gas pipeline, you can go and ask for a single regulator to oversee the entire process. So anybody who wants to contest the process can contest the process, but there's only one point of adjudication. That's led to several orders of magnitude more miles of gas transmission being built than electric transmission in this country. And so when power plant operators want to figure out where to build a power plant, they look at where the existing transmission grid is and then run a gas pipeline to it. That doesn't work very well when you're trying to build renewables out where the generation is. And the reason why I say that's a little bit hard from an environmental justice perspective is if you say, should we allow federal control and eminent domain for energy transmission? If I tell you I'm talking about oil and gas as the energy being transmitted, you're going to think about Dakota Access and Keystone and all sorts of other things. If I tell you we're going to be talking about electric, well, now we've got a different issue. And we do have a federal energy system. We do need to get power across the country. And I, for one, think we need more federal control over that, but we're going to have some hard conversations about what that means for eminent domain. So I hope I've triggered some thoughts. I see some stuff coming up in the question in the chat here, but again, I'm optimistic about the technology. I'm optimistic about what the manufacturers are doing. I'm optimistic about consumer demand. And I think we've really got to get on the ball with electric distribution to make sure that we have the generation made into where the load's going to be.
Yeah, Sean, that seems like something that a lot of people are not really aware of, is the electrification demand and transmission issues. And in the way you've outlined it here, it seems like a major challenge. So, I mean, what do we do in terms of the public understanding this? I mean, how can we make sure everybody understands that's a huge problem?
Well, I'm sure this video is going to go viral, so we've already solved that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard and wonky, and you know, I try to talk about this stuff as much as I can, but it's also, you know, there's a lot of things that we just take for granted that the government takes care of that we don't have to think about. And by the way, it's not just transmission. I was talking to some gas station operators this morning, and they said that when they go to upgrade their gas station to put in a rack of superchargers, it'll typically cost anywhere from $100,000 to $200,000 of capital, unless they have to upgrade the electric system, because it'll typically double the electric demand of a gas station.
Wow.
And so now if their utility is saying, well, the bus isn't that big, we don't have enough, the wires aren't fat enough getting in, you're going to have to pay to upgrade our system to get there. Well, who should be responsible for paying that, right? That's a good, interesting public policy question. And those sorts of things are not fundamentally different than you build out a factory that's going to put in a bunch of electric arc welders and you're going to have to do some upgrades, right? So we're used to dealing with those in more quiet ways. Mm-hmm. Would it be good to have a more public conversation? I don't know, right? Yeah. But somehow we had to solve the problem.
Yeah. Here's a question that came in. Are there federal programs to help school districts buy electric school buses? And would there be any proposals for doing that?
There absolutely are proposals to do that. Now, don't quote me on exactly where this is, but I know that let me see if I can find it here. We talked about it in our select committee report about, this is the select committee on the climate crisis that I served on last term and then again this term. We did have recommendations in that report to fund grants to encourage zero emission buses and to make sure that there are resources there. I don't think any of those programs exist yet, but we are in talks with the Biden administration about what we might be able to put together and what we might be able to pass through the Congress to provide those incentives. I suspect there are local incentives, but you'd have to check with your local officials on what those look like.
And I guess a related question to the whole area of transportation. Now that Pete Buttigieg is Secretary of the Transportation Department, does he have enough power and budget to begin solving some of this problem with pushing toward electrification and you know, some of the other related issues?
He's certainly saying all the right things. I mean, at the end of the day, Congress appropriates the money, right? So I think he has the right agenda. I am really delighted that the Biden administration has recognized that if there is no desk where the climate buck stops, the climate buck doesn't stop. So Pete Buttigieg is going to be a great Secretary of Transportation, but in many ways, I'm more excited about the fact that they are looking at the Department of Transportation in context to how it interfaces with our electric sector, how it interfaces with our agricultural sector if we're going to use biofuels, how it intersects with all these different things, because we need to be coordinated.
Somebody who should be muted, you could check we're getting some interference. Sorry about that. All right. Okay, so Sean, related to the whole energy question and providing enough power, enough transmission capability, of course, nuclear power comes up. Here's a question. Why not enhance nuclear power generation to complement the transition from oil to electric energy?
So I'm reminded, I'm sure you guys do this with your kids as well. When my daughters will periodically say, "Oh, they should fix that mall," I'll say, "Who is they?" Right? and when we talk about nuclear, there's the sense of, well, why don't you build more nuclear? Who exactly? Right?
Yeah.
And the challenge that nuclear has had, really ever since the Seabrook cost overruns that drove Public Service New Hampshire bankrupt, is that no utility is confident that they can build a nuclear plant on time or on budget, and that they can recover the resulting overruns against their rate base. And so the industry has become very spooked from building any new nuclear plants. That's not to say we shouldn't do R&D. It's not to say that maybe there isn't a case for the federal government to bridge some of that risk. But for the foreseeable future, it is very hard for me to see capital markets moving at the speed that is necessary to bring new nuclear forward to decarbonize. So for my money, I think the most important thing for us to do with nuclear is let's look at the existing fleet. Let's make sure that it's safe, that it's reliable, that we've got all those protections in, and then make sure that we can, subject to those safety considerations, we've got it relicensed and can keep it online. And if something happens technologically that brings new nuclear forward, that's great. But in the meantime, I think it's much more likely that efficiency, traditional renewables, the waste heat recovery stuff near and dear to my heart, things that capital markets are already showing an appetite for building. Let's make sure that those continue to come forward.
Yeah. And it also takes a long time to build a nuclear plant in addition to capital, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things is of course the safety issue with nuclear. And I have read a little bit about thorium nuclear reactors, that they may be safer and cheaper perhaps than uranium-based reactors.
So there are a ton of really interesting technology. One of my favorite nuclear fun facts is that the nuclear power cycle is really inefficient, and that's part of why we have such a disposal problem, because you have all this energy that's still sitting in the spent fuel rods that we weren't able to get out. And there's really interesting technologies and just an interesting math problem that if you could take the energy out of the storage rods that are currently sitting in Paducah, Kentucky, there's enough energy sitting in there to meet the entire electric loads of the country. Wow. We just need a more efficient cycle to take it out. So, yes, that thorium, do all the R&D, but you're still stuck saying, if you prove this in the lab tomorrow, you're still going to be left with somebody looking to finance the project saying, has anybody run this and operated it safely for 5 years? Because I need at least 7 to 8 years to get my money out. And did they finish it on time, on budget? And so to your point, it's just going to take time to get that through. It's not like the other technologies out there that people can say, I can identify 300 people who've built this technology. It works. I can hire a contractor who knows how to build it. They can put a construction wrap on it and offload the risk of overruns. You just can't do that with any new nuclear technology or existing nuclear technologies.
Okay. Yeah, there were a lot of other questions about nuclear. And then getting back to the transmission question, somebody says very specifically, so get down to brass tacks. How do we build high voltage direct current transmission lines from Chicago to Salt Lake City, Phoenix to Atlanta, and other places where we need them, starting today? Well,
so I'd put the same question back as the nuclear. Who exactly is going to build it, right? If it's there have been, I think, some of the really interesting proposals about how to build HVDC is that if you build it along existing rights of way and bury it, you eliminate a lot of the permitting risk. And as one of the advocates of that particular approach told me, the bad news is it's twice as expensive as overhead transmission. The good news is that no one's building overhead transmission either, so it's sort of like being twice as expensive as a unicorn. So we have to find a way to make that work. And again, that's what this thing is that this Order 1000 was talking about, is if you can figure out how to make the changes, and it's not hard to make the changes, they just have to be made through consensus processes, make the changes to electric markets so that the people who build those transmission lines can be satisfied that they'll earn a return to justify the investment. There's a lot of ways to get that done. We just haven't quite gotten that done because we've had such a balkanized electric regulatory structure where we need to connect, this load entity to this load entity, but they're both subject to different market designs, and the interconnects are hard to finagle how that works. And so there's just a lot of bottlenecks around that. Solve the market problem, and I think the capital will follow.
Where do you stand on hybrid vehicles versus electric?
So number one, I think there's a real danger in any legislator saying they have a favorite technology. If you can lower carbon and you can put your capital to work to lower carbon, God bless. Let's do more of that.
You do.
Speaking as an engineer rather than as a member of Congress, and speaking as a hybrid vehicle owner, my wife has a hybrid Toyota Highlander. She loves it.
Uh-huh.
Really up until 5 years ago, I think it was reasonable to assume that batteries were so heavy, so big, and so expensive that it was simply impossible to imagine a vehicle that consumers were going to want that was powered solely by a battery. And so the hybrid was a really interesting, fascinating technological approach to saying, how do you mate the benefits of electricity in terms of, low end, low emissions, start stop, et cetera, with the energy density of an internal combustion engine. As electric vehicles, as the technologies have advanced, I think it's an open question whether hybrids continue to be an important technology or start to become a technological dead end. Because if you could get all the range you wanted in a car that's got the size and the interior compartment range you want, and a quick recharge, a lot of those advantages start to go away. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how the market adapts to that, because a hybrid, all the things that make a hybrid vehicle really, really cool also make it really, really complicated, right? You've got to mate these mechanical and electrical systems together, and a lot of complicated clutching between those systems, and how do you integrate the regenerative brakes into a mechanical brake? And they've worked it, and it's technologically fascinating stuff, but it makes the car a lot more complicated than a pure electric vehicle. It's got almost no moving parts other than the wheels, right?
Tesla seems to be a pioneer, and I know they tout themselves very highly, but in terms of battery technology, in terms of developing batteries that store more and last longer or lighter and so forth, I mean, and it seems like Tesla's really sold a lot of the initial, EVs. And they're also promoting things like semi trucks, that are lighter and cost efficient and so forth. Are there others that are in there with Tesla that are just don't have the publicity or that you know of?
I want to be careful using my official office to promote any particular private business. I think it's interesting to go, if you want to nerd out, go to the car shows and look at how different car companies are marketing their electric vehicles. And in general, and I've been doing this for a long time. I remember years ago thinking Audi was going to do really interesting things with electric cars, because they were marketing their Quattro technology with an electric drive on every wheel, of having awesome, unbelievable low end torque on every wheel, and selling it as like a high-end performance car. Now, Audi, of course, never really did that, but that's sort of the idea that Tesla's brought along, like in a certain fashion, right? Look at the early GM EV1s, right? We've sort of forgotten about those, but there was a whole race car circuit for those EV1s, and people talked about remember they talked about the EV1 smile, because people love that acceleration. And then they morphed that into like a boring low acceleration economy car. And so I think watch the developers that are sort of pushing, saying, how do we market this towards someone who's willing to pay a price premium? And then if we can get that out there, we can drive the volume, because we're making the margin on it.
Would we ever consider introducing reduced toll fees for EV vehicles to encourage consumer demand? Sales taxes from the new vehicles could be used to build the transmission network.
Well, so I don't know about reduced toll fees. I think there's a separate issue, which was also part of my conversation with Gina McCarthy this morning, that we need to figure out how we're going to fund infrastructure in this country in a world where people don't buy gasoline. Because our highways and bridges right now are paid with gasoline tax, and as vehicles become more efficient or get electrified, that's not there. And so we're already seeing now in Illinois, where you now have to pay a sales tax premium when you buy the car to make up for the revenue that the state loses from the lost gasoline tax. And it's completely understandable why a state would do that as they go to cover this through. And if you drive an electric vehicle on the roads in Illinois, you're still wearing down the roads, right? Somebody has to repair those roads. The the right way, if you're purely just going to deal with purely a policy wonk and ignore human beings, which is not very useful, but at least as an intellectual exercise, it's useful. We ought to go to a VMT model where you pay per vehicle mile traveled and pay a tax based on your VMT, and all that requires is putting some sort of a transponder in your car that tells the government at all times where you are, so that they can keep track of that. And that kind of spooks people out because it's a little Big Brother-ish. And yet every single one of you tells Google where you are every second of the day. They know where you are right now, as long as you're carrying your cell phone. So we have already decided to give up that privacy to the private sector, who has no regulated public interest, but we haven't quite figured out politically whether we're comfortable giving that to the government. And I don't have the answer to that. That's a political question, right? We're going to have that conversation publicly, but making sure that we continue to have the money to maintain our roads and bridges in an electrifying world means we really need to shift away from gasoline taxes towards something like a road use tax, which means knowing where your vehicle is on the road.
Speaking of taxes, here's a question. I know you are a federal rep, but you should be aware that recently Illinois jacked up license plate fees for electric cars. I wasn't aware of that. Please let your state senators know we don't all drive Teslas.
No, it's exactly that issue, right? And it's I think the one state that I think is sort of out front of this is Oregon has been trying to shift to a VMT, but they're doing it on a voluntary basis to sort of start to feel out who's willing to do this, how does it work, maybe build enough comfort with the idea, and we'll see where that goes.
All right. Is FERC, I'm not sure what that is, willing to encourage renewable energy? Last year, there was an effort to enable Illinois to regulate its own capacity market because FERC's rules disadvantage renewables.
Yeah, so this is what I was saying at the start about, I call them FERC, F-E-R-C, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission.
Okay.
And there are, I'm really, really fond of the Chairman Glick, who's now running it, and Allison Clement, who's just joined. They've got a really, really sharp group of people who are grappling with all of these issues. And FERC has jurisdiction over how our markets are designed and how we make those decisions about how to make the capital investments that interconnect the seams of the system. So they are keenly aware of some of these challenges. The question about capacity markets, for those of you who aren't following this, is you get paid for energy. How many kilowatt hours do you bump in the system? And you also get paid for capacity. If I need you right now, can you ramp up and provide this load, this power? That gets hard for renewable generation, right? If I don't know, because you're going to run when the sun is shining, how do you sell capacity? On the other hand, if you deploy a lot of renewables, clearly you reduce the need for capacity in the system. And so there's a lot of almost like cutting edge regulatory thought around that. And the folks at FERC are absolutely thinking about it, and they're thinking the right way about it, but they aren't easy answers to those problems.
Okay. There was an article in the Chicago Tribune today, I guess, about electric vehicles and the GM announcement to produce all non-zero emitting cars by 2035. But it pointed out that there are side effects to that, such as job loss, perhaps. All these workers that are currently trained to make piston engines, are the skills transferable, so what do we do about that's one of the side issues, I guess.
Yeah. So there's both a real problem and a real opportunity there. And if you'll forgive me for being a little bit historic, we've gone through three major energy transitions in our time as a species. The first was when we transitioned from muscle power to mechanical power, when we figured out how to build hydro plants and steam engines. And all of a sudden we didn't have to hire people to or enslave people, whatever mechanism we used to get muscle power out. We then made a second transition when we went from mechanical power to electrical power. And we're now on the cusp of a third transition from fossil fuels to renewable fuels. Every one of those transitions has enabled us to get a lot more energy out of fewer muscles, right? And And, you know, I don't think anybody would look back and say we'd be better off if we'd never invented the steam shovel. Right? On the other hand, we can also look back and we all kind of root for John Henry, you know, because we recognize that there's a loss of some dignity in that work. And you know, the positive side of that is that an economy that is figuring out how to make more useful stuff per unit of labor is an economy that's growing its productivity and creating wealth and ultimately creating jobs. And every time we've gone through one of those revolutions, it's created more jobs than it destroyed. On the other hand, every time we've gone through one of those transitions, the people who benefited from the job creation were not the same as the people who were harmed by the job loss, right? And so I think we should embrace the transition while at the same time recognizing that the rising tide will lift the average boat, but it doesn't lift every boat. And we need to figure out as a matter of equity. And that's something that I wish people would talk about more, because we talk about how, well, we'll invest in community colleges and retraining. And yes, of course we should do that, but it is deeply, deeply patronizing to tell somebody who's been working on a transmission assembly line all their life and really understands high-speed rotating equipment that what you need to do at age 55 is go back to school and learn how to do thin film solar deposition to build a solar panel. It's offensive to say that, right? That's not what that person wants to do at that point in their life. And we need to make sure that as we have this rising tide, we look out for folks like that who, through no fault of their own, were lost out in that transition.
Related to the back to the transmission of power, transmission lines are designed for the old way of power plant with high density fuel. What happens if we invest in microgrids, intercommunicated for backup but independent?
So it's really an and, not an or. The reliability we've come to take for granted from our electric system is because we have an integrated electric system. The lack of reliability right now in Texas is because Texas has a microgrid. It's a microgrid that covers the whole state of Texas, but it's not interconnected to the rest of the country. And so when they've gotten their supply demand imbalances this week, they don't have the ability to pull on that. So, you know, and I have built and operated microgrids. I've built utility assets inside industrials that were able to completely self-sustain themselves, but they still maintained a connection to the outside world, so that when we had excess, we could dump out to there. When we had a shortfall, we could import, and you could play those economics. So a reliable grid depends on having lots of interconnected nodes. A microgrid simply means that some subset of those nodes have some independent set of control to really optimize their performance relative to what they do. And there's a ton of really cool things we can do on that front, but it's not in lieu of transmission.
Market pull and EV cars can rely on consumer choice, but aviation fuel, 30% of cost of flight, economics will require direct government subsidy, correct?
So aviation is going to be hard to electrify. And again, I said 20 years ago, who would have thunk that we'd have such a battery revolution in transportation? So maybe I'm wrong about that, but size and weight really matters on a plane. You can electrify a single passenger Cessna. It's something else to electrify a 777 with a lot of cargo and a lot of weight that you got to get through the sky. It just takes a lot of energy to do that. I think the most interesting opportunities for decarbonization that I've seen in the aviation space are more in the biofuels realm, because if we can use sustainable biofuels to displace those fossil derived fuels, or at least start to blend up, and we are starting to see some of that. You know, you can make synthetic JP8 and blend it in with traditional fossil jet fuel, so you get to on a cycle basis a zero carbon aviation fuel. Personally, just as an engineer, again, I find that a more likely path to decarbonization in the aviation sector than electrification, but maybe some smart engineer will invent something and prove me wrong.
Okay. Back to the nuclear issue. This person says, the TerraPower liquid sodium core cooled system by Bill Gates consortium seems to be a regional downsized plant construction option to make smaller reactors in many places. Are you familiar with that?
I am familiar, and I'd put it in there with thorium and in there with these things about recovering waste at Paducah. It's all great, and the private sector will build it once it pencils. I don't have any doubt about that, and we'll continue to do R&D. But in the meantime, we got to keep decarbonizing yesterday.
Okay. Just heard on NPR that wind energy is doing better in providing power than fossil fuels energy during the power outage in Texas. Don't know if that's true or not, but.
So it is completely true in the sense that I think the Texas grid on a day when everything is humming along perfectly on the Texas grid, they've got about 6,000 megawatts of wind and something like 75 megawatts of thermal capacity. Because Texas is normally warm, they don't invest in a lot of the winter protection and de-icing on wind turbine blades that they do in colder parts of the country. And they didn't do that this cycle. And so we've lost about 2 gigawatts of wind, I think was the numbers I saw yesterday in Texas. Lost not permanently, but it's decommissioned right now. So, 2 out of 6. We've lost 26 megawatts of gas turbines, and partly because of frozen pipelines, partly because the gas has been preferentially dispatched for home heating rather than for power generation, because when you've got to choose between the two, that's the safer option. So the reason for the Texas blackouts right now is overwhelmingly because of curtailments of the gas demand. There have been more modest curtailments of wind that really have to do with them not doing appropriate winterization down there. And as I said to a reporter this morning, I think it's a little bit dangerous to try to politicize this, because at the end of the day, we are in the midst of an extremely extreme weather event that is outside of statistical norms, which kind of means that we're going to see impacts on our energy system that are outside of things that people typically planned for. Maybe we learn, maybe we do things differently, but the point is to let's understand the facts on the ground and not start saying, well, this shows that my preferred technology is winning and yours is losing. That's not particularly useful.
Is the REA program a possible vehicle for infrastructure of electrification? And I'm not sure what REA program is.
Is that the Rural Electrification Act that folks are talking about? That was how we electrified a lot of rural America back in the 20s and 30s. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Maybe if the person can clarify their question, we'll come back.
Okay. Water transportation, gasoline outboards are heavy polluters. Are there going to be government funds available? Always. Are there government funds available to encourage consumers and businesses to move to electric motors for water transport, for water taxis, et cetera? I guess that's all part of the same mix. Yeah.
I will confess I don't know anything about that particular issue.
Okay. Okay. Long distance is still an issue for electric vehicles, although I've seen some that have a range of like 400 miles. Is short and long range green mass transit infrastructure part of any plan? I don't know. Yeah.
I'm sure there's going to be, everybody knows how much Biden loves Amtrak. I'm sure there's going to be a push for a lot of rail upgrades. I think the details of that, a little bit premature, but I certainly expect we'll see a push. I think a lot, some things that are interesting that become how much of this is federal policy and how much of this is local policy is all the thousands of zoning decisions we make. Mass transit, especially electrified mass transit, is really easy when people live close to the city center. When we provide incentives for people to go, buy a bunch of farmland in Romeoville and build a bunch of starter homes, that creates a different set of dynamics in a different way. I'm not saying right or wrong. I'm just saying those decisions you all make in your local community directly impact the degree to which we can act. And countries that have done a better job of mass transit have also tended to have much more constrained zoning rules.
What is your perspective on hydrogen versus or integrated with electric and the future of each? So hydrogen fuel cells?
So I think, as you guys know, I like to tweet, and I think my most viral tweet was one that I started ranting that I thought hydrogen. I shared my thoughts on hydrogen. So if you Google Casten hydrogen, you'll find it. Hydrogen is a fuel carrier. It's not a fuel. And the logic for hydrogen being a part of our long-term economy is because one can conceivably make hydrogen with an electrolyzer from renewable sources and then transport that hydrogen to some other place where it could be used as a combustible fuel that's, is still pretty light, but is denser than electrons. And you can think about ways to do that. The problem is that if you're going to take renewable electricity, make hydrogen, and then move the hydrogen someplace else, and then turn the hydrogen back into electricity, you've injected a whole bunch of efficiency penalties through that system. And you have to ask yourself, why didn't I just use the electricity in the first place? And the only reason you do that is if it is somehow cheaper to store hydrogen at high density or to transmit hydrogen at high density than it is to store electricity and transmit it at high density. We know how to store electricity, how to transmit electricity at high density. It's high voltage power lines. There is no equivalent for hydrogen. We're getting better and better at storing electricity in high density as battery technology comes along. And we've made effectively no advances in hydrogen energy storage in 30 years. It's compressed hydrogen tanks. We can compress them at higher and higher pressure, but it just takes a lot of energy to do that. And so unless and until we solve the hydrogen storage problem, which it's not clear is solvable. Thermodynamically, no one really knows how to solve this. How do you take the lightest element in the universe and pack it in really tight? It's hard, maybe impossible. But unless you can satisfy yourself with that problem, then hydrogen is an interesting niche player. Maybe it's, in certain applications, maybe in long haul trucking, it makes sense because we can store a tank on a truck and we just can't get that with something else. But I think the idea of hydrogen being the universal energy carrier of a green future, it's just hard to see that working unless you can solve the hydrogen storage problem.
Okay. Here's one about back to the utilities. So are public utilities like ComEd getting in the way of increasing clean energy? In other words, what is, their position on clean energy? You see all of these, I get mailings for various clean energy companies. They're rarely price competitive,
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, ComEd, I don't know what their policy is about clean energy or if they're able to offer it.
Well, so let me speak generally rather than about any individual utility. The way that we electrified our country, because nobody could figure out how to get people to build the capital to build all the generation and distribution infrastructure, and then sell the resulting product at a price that people wanted to pay. It's a lot of money, and how are your investors going to justify recovering it? And so the mechanism that we came up with, and it's Samuel Insull actually invented this, the guy who founded Commonwealth Edison, who built the Chicago Opera House. That was his office building. It was a very lucrative model he came up with. But what Insull said back in the 1920s was, if you give me a monopoly right to serve a territory and an obligation to serve every customer in that territory subject to my monopoly right, you can then set my rate. And I ask only that you set the rates just high enough to recover my capital. And so he created the model that it did electrify the country. I think is rightly lionized by in our history as someone who brought a huge benefit to our society. But the basic bargain that he struck was that you cannot make money as a traditional utility unless you are investing capital. Your operating costs are supposed to be pass-throughs, and you make money on the invested capital. The result of that structure has been that traditionally regulated utilities are basically, I'm oversimplifying, but they're basically agnostic with respect to the efficiency of power generation. But they have a strong bias to make sure that the power is always available and the assets to necessarily do that are built out. Now, I just described to you the electric utility industry 40 years ago. Since then, we've gone through deregulation that's a little bit different in every state. And even ComEd has, deregulated assets, regulated assets. Some of them are just generation companies. Some of them are wire companies. Everything's a little bit different now. But we still have this challenge that those utilities that are subject to that traditional regulatory model have very strong incentives in favor of reliability and essentially non-existent incentives as far as transitioning to cheaper sources of energy. That's not because they're bad people. It's because that's the way the regulatory structure was put together. And just to tell a personal story, in my last job, we actually ended up having to become a regulated utility. I didn't want to become one, but the mix of our customers was such that we were required under New York state law, we were operating to become a regulated utility. And so we basically said to the New York State Utility Commission, given this historic issue, I want to be an efficiency guy. I can't do it in this model. And so we invented a whole new structure with the blessing of the New York Public Service Utility, where we essentially became a for-profit cooperative, where they could set our rates, and at the end of the year, we had to give 50% of our profits back to the customers. And so we had an incentive to work with our customers to lower the cost of service, and then they kept 50% of what the gain was. And it's turned into a really great model. But this was something that we really had to work and innovate with the utility. I'd love to see that model nationalized, but the point is that's the exception to a much more common rule.
Here's a question going back to the thorium nuclear reactors. They inevitably, this person says, produce weapons grade uranium. This raises the larger question of nuclear fuel cycle consequences, and then the implications of the International Nuclear Ban Treaty gaining ground and continuing degradation of fuel/weapons cycle in the US. We're faced with both multi-trillion-dollar upgrades and cleanup and decommissioning and so forth. But anyway, basically, where do you stand on the nuclear treaty, and including the whole system calculation of retiring the nuclear energy and weapons cycle? So this person sees it all tied in together.
Well, it is, our civilian nuclear industry and our military nuclear industry are inseparable. The one would not exist without the other. And I guess I'd say you just have to be a little bit careful what you root for, because you can't benefit one without benefiting the other, and you can't harm one without harming the other. There's legitimate concerns, and and there's reasons why we get concerned every time a country we don't like very much is investing in civilian nuclear power, because are you going to spin those centrifuges harder and enrich more heavily, and we have to be vigilant about that. There's a parallel challenge going on in this country right now, that as a lot of our nuclear fleet is starting to retire and we lose the expertise, we are increasingly getting really low on domestic US expertise in the whole nuclear fuel procurement cycle. And so a lot of our national security folks are getting concerned that the US's ability to influence global nuclear supply chains, which can be used for good or for bad, we increasingly don't have the kind of fingers in all those chains that we used to have when we had a more robust domestic nuclear industry. And we're not training the people to do it. And so if we were to decide to just unilaterally stop doing that, well, what's Iran going to do? What's China going to do? What's Russia going to do? Yeah. And there's no easy answers to that. The genie's out of the bottle at this point, right? And so, I think we can all, yearn to be in a world where the threat of nuclear war is gone. We can all also yearn to be in a world where we don't have any global warming risk. There is a trade-off based on current technology, and how we transition from point A to point B. Yeah, it has some rippling contexts.
Yeah, shows the intricacy, the interrelationships of everything. Here's a good one. Have other countries begun the analysis to tackle this topic? Which countries are doing better than others? And that brings to mind, during the Super Bowl, there was a pretty funny GM commercial with Will Ferrell about how Norway is leading in EVs, and I'm not going to take that. It was actually quite well done. But anyway, what countries do you see as models for us?
So one of my fun little extras, the fact that we were out of the Paris Climate Accord for the last 4 years is an embarrassment, and every other country was doing a better job than us. At least they were at the table. But I think if you back up in a larger sense, what countries are doing the best job at getting the most out of the resources they have, right? Like let's frame this as a win-win. not like who's going to wear the hair shirts and who's going to sacrifice, but who's making the most out of the resources they have. And I have this fun little exercise I do periodically, and you can do this yourself. Go on the DOE or the International Energy Association website, and you can look up how much energy does every country in the world use. Not fossil energy, total energy. And then go on CIA World Factbook and look up their GDP. Put the two of them together, divide one by the other, and just rank the countries by their energy use per dollar of GDP. Because presumably, if you could make more GDP with less energy input, that means you buy less energy and you're a richer country, right? Should be all the good. What's fascinating if you do that list and then just have fun, throw out, just keep the first world countries in there, first, second world countries at least. What you'll find is that the countries with extractive economies are all down near the bottom of that list, as you'd expect. Qatar, Iran, Saudi Arabia, their economies depend on using as much energy as possible. And so they are very economically, energetically inefficient. The countries that are on the top of that list are countries that were never blessed with any significant domestic energy resource. Japan's way up there. Switzerland is way up there. The US is much closer to Qatar than we are to Switzerland. And if we simply set out to say, let's use as much energy as Switzerland does per dollar of GDP, and go to Switzerland, it's a lovely country. Like you don't walk around and feel like you're making sacrifices. We would cut our energy use in half. They use half as much energy as we do per dollar of GDP. And they're not alone. There's a lot of other countries that are in that group. And and when you start asking the question of how is it that they do that, there's 1,000 answers to that question, right? Some of it was, some of it is how they built their roads and where they funded mass transit. Some of it is these zoning decisions. Some of it is, maybe cultural. There's issues there as well. But there's a lot of examples. Denmark has done just a phenomenal job, where Denmark said a long time ago that if you're going to build a residential development, you've got to build a district energy plant there so that your power plant recovers all the waste heat and pipes the waste heat around to the building so that you don't throw away all that extra energy. And Denmark saw this huge boom in efficiency and deployment of small microgrids. There's really cool things to do. These are the things you do when you don't assume that you have an infinite, inexhaustible supply of natural resources. And of course, none of us do, but the United States has historically acted as if we do.
Is fracking safe?
There's an old saying in biology: everything is poisonous at the right dosage. Right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Nothing's safe. You can, I mean, we started this conversation about electric vehicles. There's rare earth metals that we have to use to make batteries that, that have problems with how we get those. Am I particularly concerned about, way deep water injections of water that are cracking rock, way below where the aquifer is? Not particularly. Am I concerned about using our finite freshwater resources and burying it underground where we can't get it back? Yeah, I am. I think there are completely legitimate concerns with some of the leaks and the flares, because methane, depending on what time horizon you look at, is anywhere from a 20 to an 80 times as potent a greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide. So if you have, if you convert an entire grid from coal to gas, but you have 3% leaks in the natural gas system, you've made no difference in global warming. Because you've got a 30x increase in the potency of that gas. So how you manage that? Yes, there are risks, but on the other hand, we have gone in this country over the last 20 years from emitting 1,300 to 1,400 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour to 900, and that's largely because it is way cheaper and cleaner to run a gas power plant than a coal power plant. And fracking brought a lot of cheap natural gas to market that shut down the coal industry. So at least in the short term, I think we can thank gas and fracking for getting rid of the single dirtiest form of power generation that we have. Which is not to say that there are no consequences, but like I said, There's a great history of the automobile, that when the car was first invented, a lot of the promotion of the car was that it was going to be a huge improvement in the environment. These were dirty internal combustion engines. And the reason why was because New York City was about ankle deep in manure all the time before it came along, and there was a lot of cholera and dysentery and everything that came from all that.
Yeah.
Everything is poisonous in the right dosage.
Yeah. Is the Green New Deal still alive, or is it just a thing in name only?
Look, some of you have heard me say this before. The Green New Deal is a beautiful piece of ambition that has no details, and the details are what matters. And I'm oversimplifying, but the Green New Deal and the advocates of the Green New Deal forced us to talk about the urgency with which we have to address climate change, which is great.
Okay.
If you go and I'd ask people all the time, what's your favorite part of the Green New Deal, and which is the part that you'd like to see implemented first? And you often get these glazed looks because I say, well, it's really more about the ambition than the detail. If we're going to talk about how to build this transmission, how to connect a load, how to deal with some of these environmental justice trade-offs, how to think about all these issues of utility regulation, none of that is in the Green New Deal. Right. So it's essentially a statement of where we would like to go. Terrific, we agree.
Yeah.
Now we got to work on how to get there.
Okay. So the Citizens Climate Lobby has an approach to controlling carbon rather, with a dividend approach. And then the companies that pay the dividend, they share with consumers and so forth. There is also something called cap and trade. Now, those are not the same, right? I mean, what is essential? And as I understand it, cap and trade is more of a market-based approach, or are they both market-based? It's just a difference of how you look at it.
Well, I am a huge proponent of market-based solutions to all environmental problems, and that's not just as a matter of personal preference. It's because we've seen them; they worked. You know, when we were concerned about the ozone hole, we joined the Montreal Protocol and created an international market to reduce chlorofluorocarbons. By the way, that was developed by the Reagan administration and implemented by the first Bush administration. So this was a Republican idea to use market tools to lower pollution. We then applied the same rule to sulfur dioxide markets in the acid rain trading program. Both of those markets reduced chlorofluorocarbons and then acid rain forming compounds at orders of magnitude lower costs than anybody thought was possible in a command and control approach, because markets work when you unleash all that innovation. So I'm totally a proponent of those. There are, unfortunately, in most carbon pricing regimes are not market-based. They sound market-based because they have the word price in them, but I have a real simple rule for markets. If I go to buy a pair of shoes and the amount of money I pay for shoes is not basically the same as the amount of revenue the shoe store gets, then it ain't a market, right? You wouldn't say, I'm going to pay the government $120 and then the government is going to magically find some way to put a pair of shoes on my steps and say that that's a market, right? And so if we have a carbon tax, that's what I just described as you pay the government to reduce carbon, right? That doesn't provide any incentive to reduce carbon. It just penalizes you for emitting it. And if you're going to go build a solar panel, why does it matter to you that a coal plant has a higher cost structure? You know, that's like saying that Wells Fargo got slapped with a bunch of fines last year. Did it change the interest rate you got on your bank deposit at Schwab? These are not related questions. And we've introduced a bill last year that we'll be bringing back this year, a Tradable Performance Standard Act, that gets back to the model that was used in the Montreal Protocol, was used in the acid rain trading program, where carbon sinks get paid by carbon sources, and by gradually tightening down the cap on those markets, it gets in there. If you do that with just a carbon tax, then you're basically betting that the government's going to allocate the money properly. If you do that with a tax and dividend structure, you are compelling the government to spend the money on something other than carbon reduction. And I think that's environmentally irresponsible.
So Congress is, things have changed a bit with the recent election. Are there I mean, are there a number of really strong environmentally minded Congress people that you have been working with? And is the number growing?
So we all have expertise in something. My good friend, and I think he's become a national figure this last week, Jamie Raskin. When I was first elected last term, Jamie said to me that if you want to be effective in Congress, ask people why they ran, because this job makes you very broad, but your depth is what you brought with you before. And so when you go and you want to get something done, find people who have depth in that area and then try to string together a group. So there's people, like Susan Bonamici from Oregon, who's really, really deep and informed on issues around oceans health, and thinks a lot about that. Shelley Pingree from Maine, really, really good on agricultural solutions to climate change. My lane is on the electric transmission and industrial efficiency jock. That's that's sort of my thing. I think what's a challenge that I personally find is that within the Democratic Party, you have a high concentration of people who really, really care about environmental policy. Within the Republican Party, you have a high concentration of people who really, really care about energy policy. And you cannot meaningfully affect environmental policy without understanding its impact on energy policy, and vice versa. And so what's sort of a lonely lane in Congress is the one is the place that I find myself sitting, that there are very few members who understand and are really passionate about sitting at that point in the middle. I was just speaking to some students at George Washington, their sustainability program, and they said, I really want to get into environmental policy. What should I do? And I said, you sort of have to ask over the course of your life. Let's say you started up a solar company and you were successful and you built that into it. You built a couple gigawatts of solar. That'd be a pretty good life. Let's say on the other hand, you went to work for DuPont and you figured out how to increase DuPont's energy efficiency by 10%. That would have a much bigger impact on society, right? And yet we think of one of those as being a dirty, energy intensive kind of grubby place, and the other one's environmentally pure. They both live together, right? And it's the nexus between those that matters.
Well, Sean, we don't want to take up any more of your time. You probably got a lot of congressional work to do, but it's been very enlightening, and we thank you. It's an awful lot to think about, especially from my perspective, the one about transmission lines. You push everybody to electric vehicles, you got to be able to charge them. So that's a tough one. So we thank you for your time, and everybody who's watching. We've got a couple of resource slides with a lot of different links to sources for buying electric cars and so forth. So I'm going to turn it back over to Jackie, and you can kind of take it from here. Jackie?
Okay, thank you, Jeff. And I, on behalf of the League of Women Voters of the Palatine area and the Palatine Cool Cities team, I'd like to give a special thanks to Representative Sean Casten for being our guest speaker this evening. Thank you so much. I would also encourage all of you to join in advocating for a change that will lead to a transportation transformation and a greener future. The resources on the following 3 slides will be sent to all of you in an email from the League of Women Voters Palatine area tomorrow. They can also be found on the League of Women Voters Palatine website, along with the recording of tonight's program. So these are the resources in front of you. And there's a little note at the top that some of these organizations listed on these slides are for-profit companies. The League of Women Voters of the Palatine area does not endorse these organizations. Their inclusion here is for informational purposes only. So you'll see at the beginning, of course, we've put the League of Women Voters website and the Palatine Cool Cities Environmental Team Facebook page. And we have Plug-in America Advocacy Group, Plug-in America Vehicle Selection Assistance, Normal Now, Electrical Vehicle Information, Zero Emissions, Transportation Tomorrow, Forbes article on reducing carbon emissions, Illinois Environmental Council video on electrical vehicles in Illinois, article on alignment between policy, finance, and technology, video on economics of Tulsa's new semi-trucks. Chicago Area Clean Cities website, smart vehicle charging solutions, building of electric charging stations, articles on Zion National Park getting electric buses, the Illinois Environmental Council website on Illinois with the 4th most roadways in the United States, and U.S. Department of Energy Alternative Fuels Data Center. And with that, this concludes our program, and I thank you all for spending the time with us and attending as we move forward to that greener future.